It's creepy to go missing. It's scary to realize that you have no idea where someone is, if they're alive or dead. Missing people are often never found, but sometimes the mystery is uncovered even many years later. In this episode, there are just such cases, including the most recent ones. This is Infinity, and today I'll tell you about the most mysterious disappearances solved in 2021. And not only 25 years. That's how long it took to cross a girl named Kristen Smart off the missing persons list. Her disappearance and the story of her disappearance is a true detective mystery, and the resolution of her disappearance has become one of the major forensic sensations of 2021. But first things first. In 1996, Kristen graduated from high school and enrolled at California Polytechnic State University. At the end of May 1996, there was to be a big birthday party for one of the students at the fraternity house. Kristen had planned to go to this party, but her friends declined the idea. The girl ended up going to the party alone. The party was most typical. You've all seen these parties in the movies and even gone to such events. Big company, alcohol, red cups, music, and so on. It's hard not to have a few too many drinks in such a place, especially when you're still young. And that's exactly what happened to Kristen. At night, feeling sick, she decided to go to her dorm. The girl could barely weave her legs, so two students, Cheryl and Tim, decided to walk her home. They were soon joined by another student, Paul Flores. He offered to walk Kristen to her dormitory because he himself lived closest to the place. Kristen said goodbye to Cheryl and Tim and walked to the dorm with Paul, and no one else saw her later. Margarita, Kristen's roommate, was the first to worry. Kristen hadn't been back from the party for a long time, and she'd left most of her personal belongings at home, so it was unlikely she could have gone to another city. Until the last, Margarita hoped that Kristen had just hung out and would soon show up, but 2 days later she finally went to the police. The police officers were in no hurry to begin their search. It wasn't until several days after the report was filed that the police decided to call Kristen's parents, who were already nervous, and it wasn't until 4 days after Kristen went missing that the search began. They yielded nothing. Interviews with witnesses and suspects didn't either. And while it was obvious that Paul Flores was the prime suspect, there was no direct evidence against him. Interestingly, even the strange scratches and bruises on the guy didn't embarrass the cops. The search became more and more extensive, but there were still no results. Soon the case began to subside, and on the 6th anniversary of Kristen's disappearance, she was pronounced dead. The case didn't get off the ground until 2018-2019, thanks to Chris Lambert. This guy had been hosting podcasts about various crimes, and one day he decided to conduct his own investigation into Kristen's disappearance. First, Chris found out about Paul Flores' bad reputation from university students. It turned out he often molested and abused female students. Also, he revealed a number of irregularities in the work of the police. It turned out that they didn't even go to the house of Paul's mother, the prime suspect of the case, although one of the main clues was hiding there in that house. Chris Lambert discovered that 4 months after Kristen's disappearance, a woman named Mary Lassiter had rented the house of Paul's mother. In one of the rooms, the woman found an earring that resembled part of the necklace worn by Kristen the night she disappeared. The same necklace was on photographs of the girl that were hung on billboards literally everywhere. It got more interesting. The yard at Paul's mother house had always been poured with concrete, but shortly after Kristen disappeared, a piece of concrete was cut from there and a flower bed was planted there. Weird, isn't it? Mary told Chris a frightening fact. The first time she'd moved in, every day at 4:20 a.m., she'd heard a sound like the alarm clock on a wristwatch. The sound came from the backyard of the house and from under the very same flower bed. One day the sound stopped. Most likely the clock's battery had run out. With this information, Lambert went to Kristen's mother. When the woman heard the story about the alarm clock, she was speechless and couldn't say a word for several minutes. As she later recounted, Kristen always set her alarm for 4:20 a.m. because she had to be to work at 5 o'clock in the campus recreation center. It all became abundantly clear. In 2019, Chris told the story at his podcast, which went viral. That pushed the case forward. The police took up the investigation again. This time they did it with particular enthusiasm. In 2020, police dug up the yard at Paul's mother's house. Although Kristen's body wasn't there, They found evidence that there had been remains under the flower bed for some time. In 2021, the case was, in fact, solved. Paul and his father were arrested. The court charged Paul with murder. According to the investigation, when Paul and Kristen were left alone, he began molesting the girl, but she rebuffed. This explains the origin of the scratches and bruises found on Paul at the first interview after Kristen's disappearance. During the struggle, Paul apparently killed Kristen, took her to his mother's house, where Paul buried the body with the help of his father and disguised the place as a flower bed. Sometime later, they decided to dig up the remains and move them to an unknown location. The father and son pleaded not guilty, and court proceedings continue to this day. But there are a lot of facts and evidence working against them, so it's unlikely that they'll escape punishment. If Kristen's disappearance stunned all of America, then Ilya Gribov's disappearance was one of the major events in Russian forensics last year. At the end of August 2021, Ilya left home with his dog and disappeared. It turned out that Ilya had arranged for a friend to give him a ride to a nearby settlement of Makovsky. He never got to his friend. By evening, Ilya had already disappeared. Strange things began to happen soon. Ilya's dog was found in Makovsky the very next day. On surveillance cameras, it was established that the dog was thrown out of the car. Volunteers and police officers searched the car for a few days and tried to make out the license plate number. It wasn't until sometime later that they were able to do so. Before that, the license plate number was too blurry on cameras. The police and volunteers were able to trace the license plate to the car's owner, who reported that his car had been stolen for over a year, which confirmed his statement to the police. The car had been moving freely around the city for a year and had been parked in approximately the same spot. The case seemed to drag on, but soon the disappearance was solved. A man came to the police and said he knew where the missing man was. The police immediately went to the scene. The address was a garage. Inside there was a hole dug out and filled with fresh concrete where Ilya's body was. Although Ilya was found and the suspect was identified, it's still unclear whether it was self-defense or whether the criminal intentionally came to murder Ilya. Ilya Gribov's disappearance was solved very quickly. The whole story lasted no more than a couple of weeks. But that's not always the case. Kristen Smart's story shows that sometimes it takes 25 years for the truth to come out. And the next story shows that sometimes it takes more than half a century. Finally, I'll tell you the story of Mary Arcuri, whose disappearance was not solved until 54 years later. The story of Mary Arcuri began in 1964 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA. Mary lived with her husband, Albert, and their 2 children. One day, grief-stricken, Albert gathered friends and family together and told them the sad news. Mary had left her family and moved in with another man. Since then, relatives and acquaintances never saw her again. In time, Mary was reported missing, and years later her disappearance was almost forgotten. It all came to a head in 2018 when the remains of a woman were discovered in the yard of a home in Pittsburgh during renovations. It wasn't easy to determine the identity of the deceased. Police launched an investigation. Retired Pittsburgh Assistant Police Chief Therese Rocco became involved. She used to run the Missing Persons Unit and kept a file of unsolved cases in her basement. By happy coincidence, Rocco discovered that once upon a time, the house in whose yard the bones were found belonged to the family of her friends, Mary and Albert Arcuri. It turned out that Rocco and Mary had been very close friends when they were young. They lived next door. Rocco helped detectives contact Mary and Albert's daughter, Donna. They found remains and a DNA sample of Donna were sent for analysis. In February 2019, 54 years after the woman's disappearance, forensic results confirmed that the remains belonged to Mary Arcuri. It's unknown whether Albert killed her or whether the cause of death was an accident. One thing is certain, Mary never left the confines of her home and was always there. That's all, guys. Which person's disappearance do you consider the most mysterious in history? Let me know in the comments.